Delegations from 164 countries participated in this conference, and the Indian delegation is being led by Indian Trade and Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal. To discuss this ministerial conference, what are its importance?
So, India, in fact, stressed on these issues and also highlighted the need for avoiding the fragmentation of the multilateral system. And the related issue, which is of concern to India and other developing countries, is the importance of remaining focused rather than mix non-trade issues with the WTO agenda. So these were the four major issues, broad general issues. But then if you come down to some granular issues, which are very important for India, they relate to food security, first of all, and also the system that many countries like India in the developing world have of stock holdings and distribution and also procurement of food grains for development purposes. A vast majority of the populations, for example, in Africa, etc., cannot actually afford the high prices of food, and therefore the state has to step in there. And that's something which India wants to preserve as well. As you know, we have a large population and a very important agricultural sector, which India would like to sustain and also take forward. So that was one major issue. Related to that issue is the livelihood of fishermen. And both these issues have been in focus at the WTO for quite a number of years, and there has been no resolution to these issues so far.
So, sir, if we talk of this first issue which you talked about, public stock holding of grains for food security in India and other nations which are less developed or developing, India has always been batting for a permanent solution to food security, this particular issue at WTO, and has been demanding an amendment in formula to calculate food subsidy cap. Can you tell us a little bit more about this issue? What is the point of dispute between the developing and the developed world? And how likely is it that a resolution will come up?
I think India has, as you rightly said, put forward very detailed proposals in this regard. And that has come out of its very vast and extensive experience of dealing with this issue within India for a long period of time. I think the main issue here is that while developing countries like India look at it in terms of an essential requirement for the WTO to have a view and to solve, the developed world does not see it that way. And that is because the stock holding of food grains for food security is something which they have not faced in their own countries. So how to prevent the stockholding distribution components from not happening is of great concern to the developing world. And that is why the permanent solution to food security, which has been put forward, is that a percentage of food grains should be reserved for countries to be able to stockpile for public distribution, while the rest can be given free play to the free market forces. And that is exactly what India has been doing. Is if you look at what the system is right now, 40% of food grains are reserved for stockpiling and stockholding and then distribution, etc. But the rest, we allow free trade and a free floating price of food grain, which obviously stabilizes the world prices as well. India is a large agricultural economy, and the fact is that our agricultural labor and other agriculturists who are in this field cannot afford to have a system where there is a complete free-for-all in the economy for these prices.
In fact, they said some developed countries provide subsidies which are 200 times than the subsidies provided by the developing countries. And it was the membership's duty to ensure a level playing field in international agriculture trade for millions of low-income or resource-poor farmers. So you feel that within the farmer community also, the way we are saying that there should be a concern for developing countries, there should be concern for the low-income and resource-poor farmers who are mainly found in the poor countries.
That is exactly the point here, because I think every country speaks at the WTO from their own situation prevailing in their own country. And as you rightly said that Western Europe, for example, has been subsidizing its agriculture for a long period of time. They have larger holdings as well, which is a difference in terms of the way agriculture is organized in their countries. And that means that it's highly mechanized and farming, which the state subsidizes to a large extent because they've got the resources to do so. In the case of India and other developing countries, this is not feasible, not possible, for the state to dole out some subsidies of that scale. But what is required is, of course, that the prices of food grain within which is available to the population within a country is kept at the minimum possible, so as to ensure that the basic food security of the people is met. And obviously, large countries such as India are in a particularly vulnerable situation if this is not allowed going forward.
And sir, regarding protection of interests of fishermen, can you tell us a little bit more about this controversy again, which has been brewing for a long time? And how far do you think a resolution will be reached to curb overfishing, overcapacity, and promote sustainable fishing? While seeing that country like India, 90 lakh fishermen, they are dependent on fishing for their livelihood. And whereas the developed countries, they have promoted commercial fishing on a big scale. So that differentiated approach is very important.
Yes, again, it's the question of how much resources you have. At the last ministerial, we saw that after long negotiations of 21 years, WTO members had agreed on this agreement, fishery subsidies. So that sets new global rules to curb the harmful subsidies and protect the global fish stocks in a manner that also recognizes the needs of fishers in developing and least developed countries. In fact, that agreement prohibits support for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, the IUU fishing, as we call it, and it bans actually support for fishing in overfished stocks. Then again, that agreement also seeks to curb subsidies for overcapacity and overfishing by ending the subsidies for fishing on the unregulated high seas. Now, if you look at reality, what is happening is that countries like China, for instance, have a large scale illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. We have countries in Europe and Taiwan for that matter, who send their trawlers deep into unregulated high seas. There is no implementation capacity, any international organization, to actually check what is happening. So it goes against the very grain of this agreement, which was reached after painful negotiations. But what happens to the developing world? And of course, India is a little more developed in that sense, because as far as the maritime sector is concerned, India is far ahead within the developing world. So it does not affect India to the extent that it actually harms countries in the Pacific, for instance. And because of that, their fish stocks are depleting considerably. And the result is that this agreement is totally nullified in its aims. So once again, if you have curbs which are implemented only on a section of the agreement, then obviously it is a lopsided implementation of that agreement. And this is what India has been saying at the WTO ministerial.
And so another aspect is the dispute resolution mechanism, which has effectively been defunct since December 2019. Can you tell us how important is it to restore this? Why has it not been restored for the last 4 years? And how do you see the road ahead? How important is the restoration of this mechanism?
So the dispute resolution mechanism is again a very important mechanism for the weaker countries of the WTO. And if you don't have this mechanism, then the more powerful and the more important economies of the world can have their way with a less developed economy. And this is why countries like the United States, for instance, did not allow the filling up of posts of the arbitrators who were retiring at the end of their term. The result was that you don't have a quorum of the dispute resolution mechanism, and they cited economic reasons for it, that the budgets were not enough, etc., to support that mechanism. They also said that the process of appointment of the arbitrators was not equitable, and that because of numbers, the developing countries were actually choosing their own arbitrators in the dispute resolution mechanism. But that is something which has existed for a long period in time. And when it suited the developed world, when globalization was in full force, they had raised no such objections at that point in time. The result is that we've had a defunct mechanism for solving trade disputes. And so when trade disputes arise between the powerful and the weaker countries, and obviously the powerful countries and the larger economies can have their way, there is no recourse to the weaker economies, to countries who cannot actually mobilize opinion in their favor. So this is why India has been saying that the dispute resolution mechanism must be brought back into its full force, and that the mechanism of choosing arbitrators, if it's not satisfactory, then it can be revamped and we need to discuss proposals.
And so, as you had mentioned earlier, joint support initiatives like China-led proposal for an investment facilitation for development. Now, these have been opposed by India, saying that these are outside the mandate of WTO. How important is this that the main issues of public stock holding, ensuring food security, protecting the interests of fishermen, which have been sort of going on for a long time, which have not been resolved yet, those are given the entire focus, and this diversion doesn't take place to those issues which can be discussed at other forums.
Many issues that have no concern with the WTO or no traditional concern with the WTO are being brought into the WTO process. And that has been brought in by countries who have their own vested interest to do so. Of course, it takes away the focus from the main issues for the developing countries. That's the main reason why they're there. But as far as China is concerned, it also suits the Chinese to open up economies of, again, countries who are less powerful than them, who cannot actually go into any arbitration mechanism. And they can always say that this is decided by the WTO. And India knows that if a situation like that arises, then obviously the countries who have the Indian expansionist mode, in an economic mode which is also very aggressive, can actually dominate economies. And in the Chinese case, it is opening of markets in Africa in particular, and which has led to this initiative. The same goes for the Western European countries and the United States, who would also like to do the same. But as far as the developing world is concerned, they do realize that this is not in the interests of the developing countries, and therefore India and South Africa actually made a pushback to these proposals, and rightly so, because there has been no proposal for the developing countries which has found so much of interest as these new non-WTO matters.
So, sir, do you think that there'll be some very decisive outcome from this conference, or you feel that the negotiations will continue and we can hope for some outcomes in the near future?
I think the negotiations will continue because this is a tradition of the WTO nowadays. There's a deep divide between the developed and the developing world, and there's a tendency to push forward proposals which do not actually concern the WTO. In the past, we used to see a number of such proposals going through because the developing world did not have a voice. But today we have countries who also have a voice from the developing world, like India, Brazil, South Africa, the other economies which are in a similar situation. So therefore, it's not so easy for the WTO ministerials to actually take decisions on contentious issues such as this. And there is definitely going to be some amount of give and take going forward, and that requires some time.
Thank you so much, sir, for this insightful discussion on the various points and various issues which are before the 13th Ministerial Conference of WTO and how India is impacted by it, how India is participating in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on India's perspective on WTO reforms, processes, and farmers' interests. The participants were Anil Vadhva, former ambassador, and Sonu Sood, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsttalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.